Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Christian. I'm going to be doing a series of modules for you over the course of your class. Today, we're going to be talking about global issues. Just what are global issues? And today is kind of an overview of what's going to be happening for the rest of your semester. So, what are global issues? Dr. Saglam is going to give you two definitions that are pretty important. The first one is the more obvious of the two. Global issues are issues that cross political borders and affect individuals in more than one country. This is pretty straightforward. Um, the first one that usually comes to mind is issues of war and peace. This picture that you can see now is the military demarcation line between North and South Korea. That war was kind of a global war, even though we don't call it a world war, where the United Nations defended South Korea and China defended North Korea. Issues of war and peace are largely what's talked about in global issues, but it is by far not the only thing that we can be talking about. The second one that we have is from the Department of Homeland Security. It's citizenship and immigration services. Immigration is obviously people crossing borders. We're going to be talking a lot about that in a few more modules. And citizenship, just by having a passport and crossing a border, you are involved in global issues. And part of that is crossing borders can be in sports. The man in green is a Brazilian who is playing for a South Korean soccer team in the Asian Champions League against the UAE club, Al Ain. And this number 29 is a South Korean player playing against the Korean team. And it's more interconnected than just that. Who gets to play sports? Who gets to travel to play sports? Um, is a global issue. What governing body governs global sports? And soccer, of course, is FIFA. Um, but what power do they have? The United Kingdom chose to leave the European Union. What impact is that going to have on United Kingdom soccer leagues versus the rest of the continent? Can English players go to play in Italy if they want? And what about the Olympics, right? What about baseball? Can Cuban players come to the United States to play baseball? These are all global issues. The second definition that you're going to have is a little bit, it's not something we usually think about, but issues that do not necessarily cross borders, but affect a large number of individuals throughout the world. The first picture that I have for this is representing elections. We often think of elections as just something that happens within a border and doesn't really have global ramifications. But if one candidate believes climate change is a problem and another candidate says climate change is not a problem, climate change will not be affecting only the United States of America. And similarly with immigration policy, that will affect other people, trade relations. And it's not just the United States. Every liberal democracy in the world, every time they have an election, that is a global issue. At the time of this recording, South Korea just had parliamentary elections. And the party in power actually picked up more seats. And that party in power tends to be a little more friendlier with North Korea. And how that interaction is a global issue. Interestingly enough, North Korean defectors actually just won 2 or 3 seats in the parliament, not for the party in power, but for the more hawkish, the more conservative party. Um, every time Australia has an election, how they want to interact with their neighbors, they have a lot of immigrants from Southeast Asia and from China, and how they want to interact with their neighbors. Every Australian election is a global issue. It's the same with Japan, the same with Taiwan, and how Taiwan is going to interact with mainland China. Every election is a global issue. Um, Again, at the time of this recording, COVID-19 is kind of a big deal. I hope that if you're listening to it in the future, that things are a little bit better. Viruses can cross borders. And so while that might fit under the first category, this is here to remind us that health infrastructure in developing countries is a global issue, because just because a virus starts in a city in China does not mean that that virus is going to stay in that city, in that country, on that continent. It can, and they do, cross borders. Before COVID-19, there was a case of SARS, which was another coronavirus. We've had issues with MERS, it's a Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. Again, Middle Eastern, but it didn't stay in the Middle East. H1N1, avian flu, Ebola. There was a problem with Ebola in Africa several years ago. That sanitation standards across the globe are global issues. Health infrastructure in every country is now a global issue. And this was a picture of Australian wildfires that they had earlier this winter in the United States, December, January 2019, January 2020. And again, these fires are happening in Australia, they were happening in the Amazon, but those fires are a direct result of climate change, and their infrastructure again becomes global issues, and how they maintain their land and how other countries fight climate change is suddenly another global issue. So I've talked a couple times about states, and I've talked about people and parties. So who exactly is involved in global issues? Our actors, the first actor that we need to talk about are states. And we're going to talk a bit more about states and what that term actually means in the next module. But for now, it's enough to say that states equals countries, right? In the United States, we hear the word state and we think of, Georgia or California or Oregon or Oklahoma, right? But in the international relations field, in international affairs, we hear the word state and we think country. Canada is a state, the United Kingdom is a state, France is a state, India is a state, China is a state, Australia is a state, and so on and so forth. Again, it gets a little more complicated. We're going to talk about that in a later module, but for right now, when we hear states, we should be thinking of federal governments. The second one that we want to be talking about are intergovernmental organization, IGOs. Intergovernmental organizations are organizations put together by governments to facilitate dialogue between states. These intergovernmental organizations set rules for how states will interact with each other, and they also set up punishments if those rules are broken. Each intergovernmental organization must have at least 3 states. It can have all of the states in the world, but it must have at least 3. If it has 2, it's not an intergovernmental organization, it's a treaty. It must have 3. And so with that, let's take 2 seconds. You can pause me if you want, and I want you to think of some intergovernmental organizations you might have heard of. Okay, I hope you all thought of the United Nations as the largest intergovernmental organization. The UN has like 190 something countries, and they get together in a big room and they pass they pass declarations, and sometimes they're binding. They pass resolutions, and sometimes they're binding, and sometimes they're not binding. And it's complicated. We're going to talk about the United Nations in detail in a later module. So that's legislated. We also have um, banking international intergovernmental organizations. I'm sorry. We have banking intergovernmental organizations like the World Bank. The World Bank's is comprised of a lot of countries, and their goal is to lift poorer states out of poverty. China got kind of fed up with that, and so they started another intergovernmental organization called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and their goals are very similar, and that is to lift states out of poverty. You also have military alliances that can be intergovernmental organizations like NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that was founded again after World War II as a counter to the Soviet Union and its allies. NATO is made up of states around the North Atlantic area, mostly the United Kingdom, France, the United States, Canada, Germany, etc. And then you also have judicial intergovernmental organizations like the International Criminal Court. Its jurisdiction is complicated, and I believe we'll be talking about that again in a later module. The third actor we're going to talk about are non-governmental organizations, NGOs. NGOs are not run by states. NGOs are exactly what they say, non-governmental organizations. They usually focus on one thing, and they can be huge NGOs. A big one is Amnesty International, that focuses on human rights around the world. Another huge NGO is Greenpeace, that focuses on climate change and environmental policy, again, around the world. NGOs work together to raise awareness. They lobby governments to help their specific cause. An often overlooked actor in global issues are individuals. States have a lot of power, and intergovernmental organizations have a lot of power, and NGOs have a lot of power, but it's worth remembering that individuals also have a voice. And on this slide, we have Greta Thunberg, who is world famous right now for raising awareness on climate change. Also pictured are Bill and Melinda Gates, who are working very hard to work on health infrastructure in Africa. They partner with Partners in Health a lot. Their foundation does. And it's not just them. We also, as not billionaires and not world famous people, we also have a voice. And many times we don't use it. We get to vote with our feet and vote with our money. And in every decision we make, we can work to make the world a little bit of a better place. And let's look at the top UN global issues for 2020, according to the UN. Their first one is climate change, as it is for many people. Many NGOs, many intergovernmental organizations are focused on climate change. Sustainable development goals. The UN set a specific number of goals to reach by the end of the decade, and one of them is to lower extreme poverty and have sustainable development. Their third one is inequality and exclusion. We usually hear inequality and we think money, but in fact, inequality and exclusion, they're also focused not only on poverty and money, but also on education for everybody, making sure everybody has equal access to education, and health and living standards. Conflicts, rise of terrorism in between states and non-state actors, and the united world. The UN turns 75 this year. So that is a brief overview of your intro to global affairs class, and I will see you in the next module.